Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's time to get started. This is a webinar about pdfChip 1.1, which is the first maintenance release of the still somewhat new pdfChip product from Callus Software. And what I will try to do in the next half hour to an hour, I don't really know how long it will take. It depends on questions as well. What I'll try to do is give you an overview of the major new things that you find in 1.1. This is a free update. It's a minor version update. It's a free update for anyone who has pdfChip 1.0. It also doesn't change really how the product works. It's an incremental update if you want, but we'll cover that. Time to get going with this. As said, this is about pdfChip 1.1, and what you see on here are the major topics. I have a presentation, but I will change that. Well, I won't do presentation the whole time. I will go back and forth to pdfChip and show you some of the stuff that we're talking about here as well to make it more clear. Now, for those of you who are perhaps not really aware of what pdfChip is, I'm not going to go in many details here. I don't have time for that in this particular webinar. There are a few webinar recordings on our website. You can find those either on 4ps.com or on callussoftware.com. And on both websites, look for tutorials in the support section, and you'll find a number of recorded webinars from the release of 1.0, for example. Okay, but in one slide, very short overview. What is pdfChip? Well, it's a command line tool, so no user interface. This is something that you will have to integrate into either a scripted solution or something like FileTrain or Switch. It's a command line tool to convert HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into good PDF documents. And it supports most of the PDF features, even the ones not supported natively by HTML and CSS. That means you can use CMYK color, spot color, you can create PDFA or PDFX documents, and so on. It has full support for SVG because it's built on WebKit. It also has full support for JavaScript, and that means that you can use also many of the more complex libraries, something like Madjax to support MathML, something like jQuery that you know from website development. All of those can simply be used in pdfChip, and that means that if some features are perhaps not there. I'm thinking of good hyphenation for certain languages. Well, the only thing you have to do is find the JavaScript library that supports that, hyphenator.js, for example, include that into your HTML template, and then pdfChip can make full use of that functionality. And then the last thing I want to single out is that pdfChip also comes with a built-in barcode library, which lets it create on the fly almost any type of barcode that you can possibly think of. So as I said, this is only one slide. My intention is not to give you an overview of what pdfChip does. But go back to those other webinar recordings to review that if you need to. I will focus on what is new in 1.1 in this webinar. And what is new? Well, as all new technology, there were some things that we discovered once we started getting involved in projects with it. So some of those early problems have been fixed. But then also what we tried to do is, on the one hand, make pdfChip easier to use. And you can see there that it talks about, for example, better logging and so on. All of the other features I will come back to in more detail. So making it easier to use in projects, making it easier to integrate, for example, and to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And then also allow projects that were not possible with version 1.0. 1.0 version always has limitations, and what we try to do in 1.1 is implement some of the things that people asked about most frequently. And I will come back in detail on those as well. So let me go over some of the smaller improvements before we do anything else. And the first one of those is the capability to limit the number of pages that pdfChip generates. Now, perhaps this needs a little bit of explanation, but you know that what pdfChip does is to take an HTML template and convert that into PDF. Now, HTML by itself is typically a non-paged format, which means that you get everything in one long document and you have to scroll. PDF is the opposite. You have pagination. That's what we want to do. And it's not always easy in some cases to predict how many pages are going to be generated. And the typical problem is that you want to, for example, generate a one-page flyer, but because of the way the HTML is built and because of what you're trying to do, you end up having 2 pages, and the second page is typically blank or almost blank. Also a very common problem when you try to print HTML pages. You can work around that typically, but it can be challenging to do so in your HTML template. And what you can do in pdfChip 1.1 is simply either use a command line argument, max pages, or you can use an extra argument for the cchip print pages function. And both can be used to limit or set the amount of pages that you maximally want to output with pdfChip. If you use the command line parameter, then you limit the amount of pages for the complete pdfChip call. If you use the print pages variable, then you limit the amount of pages generated by each print pages command. So if you use this in a loop, you can make sure that if you output business cards, for example, and they're double-faced, you can make sure that you have 2 pages for each business card, but still end up with a document that is 1,000 pages. So different approaches to end up with the same result. And instead of just continuing to talk about that, let me show you what that is. Now, what I've done here is I have a couple of examples, and for all of these examples, I actually have build scripts to make it easier to see what is going on here. Let me open up a baseline script here, and in that you can see, let me see if I can increase the size of the text here a little bit. No, of course not. Not in Xcode, of course. Okay, so what I want you to be looking at is this one line. This is a standard pdfChip call. It does pdfChip, which is in my script set to the path and location of where pdfChip is installed on my system. So I basically call the pdfChip application, and then I give it index.html and result.pdf. That's, of course, the input HTML. This is the output PDF file that I want to generate. Now, if I go to here and I run that script, what it will do is build a PDF document. And that PDF document in this case is a little business card, and it has 2 pages. So it's actually a proper business card. The green here is a spot color. I have a QR code that is dynamically built with the URL for the website on the business card and so on. But this is the regular case. I have a very simple index.html, and I can open that here, or I can show you that it is actually quite simple. Just some divs with some objects in here. Here you see the barcode being defined and so on. And because of the way I set this up in CSS, it generates 2 pages. Now, if I take the other build script that I have here, it also builds a PDF file for me, but in this case, it builds a PDF file with only 1 page. And the only difference that I have is that build script, where at the top, I have the regular command line for pdfChip. At the bottom, I have an additional command line argument, max pages, that gets set to 1. So simply adding that to the command line without changing anything else limits, puts a hard limit to the amount of pages that are generated by that HTML template. Okay, so not useful for all projects, but if you have a project where you know that you're going to have one-page output, for example, or two-page output, then you can use this to make sure that even if your HTML template is very complex, it will only output the number of pages that you need. Okay, next, let me go back to my presentation, and the next one is one that I am not going to demo, but I will show you what the syntax looks like in the presentation. pdfChip 1.0 supported many different color spaces that were not supported in HTML and CSS. It had support for CMYK, spot color with all kinds of different alternate color spaces, LAB colors, and so on. Now, what it couldn't do is device N. For those of you who are not very familiar with that PDF construct, device N is a way to define a color space that has a mix, potentially a mix of CMYK and a number of spot colors. So I could build something that is CMYK plus a bunch of spot colors, or I could build a color space that consists only of a number of spot colors. And if you imagine how a duotone looks like, or a tritone looks like in Photoshop, where you assign 2 or 3 different spot colors to an image, well, it's to encapsulate that construct in PDF that this was invented. And in pdfChip 1.1, we give you the opportunity to define a device N color space. And here you see how you could do that in CSS, and to then use it just as you use other color spaces. So the top CSS rule that you see there defines a device N color space. That's the cchip device N bit at the top. You give that a name. In this case, I gave it the name plus red because I'm talking about something that you very frequently see in digital these days, CMYK plus an additional color, in this case red. And then the components part defines which colors you have in there. And in this case, I have defined a number of spot colors. Actually, 4 of them correspond to the process colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. You can see that for all of them, I give CMYK equivalents. And then the 5th color in this case is called red and has a different alternate value applied. Now, in this case, I'm using spot colors that all have a CMYK alternate. I could just as well put spot colors with an LAB alternate in there as well. All of that works. But that gives you a way to define a color space, if you want, that is called plus red, and that is a device N color space. And then the bottom rule that you have in that CSS fragment, the dot red, says any object, any element in HTML that defines this dot red class will now use as color the device N color space defined above, the device N color space with the name plus red, and with the values, in this case 00001. And that means that all of my CMYK colors are 0, so no CMYK component in here. And then the spot color red that is defined as the 5th color is 100% in this particular example. So this is the way how you would set that up in CSS. You would first define it as an object so that pdfChip knows to create a device N color space in the PDF file that it is generating, and then you can use that color space in other rules in your CSS file. Very similar to how you would set up fonts, where you first link a name with a font file and then use that font definition in other rules in the CSS document. So I have a demo of this one, but this is a smaller item that is new for version 1.1. Just to remind you again, if you have any questions about this, don't hesitate, simply enter them in the questions box and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. A slightly bigger topic, and this is one that has come back in discussions over and over. It's not an easy one to solve, and The issue is with passing information to an HTML template. And there are various ways you can fix that. For example, you can write something to an XML file from your PHP scripting. For example, you could write a bunch of information to an XML file, and then in your pdfChip HTML template, you could open that XML file, read the data from it, and then use that. That turns out to work very well. But it also turns out to be relatively difficult because you have to, first of all, from PHP, write that XML, and then you have to open the file and read it and then parse it in your pdfChip template. That's a lot of lines of code, both PHP and JavaScript, to accomplish something that should be relatively easy. And in pdfChip 1.1, there is an addition to the product, to the command line, that allows you to be a little bit more efficient with that. Why? Well, for all of those cases that you run into when you start thinking about pdfChip, you do a database query and you want to pass that information to a template. You have some simple values that you want to include in a template. That's the example that I will be using later on. I want to generate a business card, and where does that information come from the business card? Someone might fill that out in a website, in a form, but you have to be able to transport it to the template. Or you want to pass on, for example, an XML file that was exported from an MIS system or a database, and then pass the path to that file onto the template. So for all of those cases, you need a mechanism to exchange information. And the way you can do that in pdfChip 1.1 is with an additional command line parameter called --import. And that uses a double piece of information at the back. So it's import equals, then you have a name, a colon, and then you have a path and a name to a JSON file. If you don't know what a JSON file is, it's a way to serialize, an easy way to serialize objects. So you can take a JavaScript object and very easily convert it into a string that you can write into a file and then afterwards can read again. And many languages have built-in support to generate JSON files, and even if they don't, it's relatively easy to write them correctly. So a name and a path to the JSON file. Of course, the information from the JSON file is then going to be read by pdfChip. So pdfChip will open that JSON file that you pointed to, and it will store that information into a variable. And you can access that variable in your pdfChip template by using /chip, that's the built-in /chip object, .user, which is a collection of stuff stored by the user in that /chip object, and then the name of that variable, and that name corresponds, of course, to the name that you have on the command line. Now, how do you do that in reality? Let me go to the next example here. Like I said, a very simple example. If I open this up in a browser, I again have an HTML file for a business card. So it's exactly the same business card as I had before. And what I want to do now is I want to create that business card, but I want to pass in other information. For example, something that a client has entered into a form on a website. So I have my templates. I don't want to generate what is in the template, but I want to replace information that is in that template first. Now, the information in this case comes from the JSON file. If I open that JSON file, you can see what that looks like. It's a very simple object in this case, where I have different also sub-objects, name, title, email, website, and each of them is linked to a string. So this is a basic key-value pair. JSON files can get a little bit more complex than this. They can have arrays and other objects and so on and so on. This is a very simple example of a JSON file that I have here. So this information I want to show in that business card. Now, the first thing that I need for that is a modified command line. So if I go look at my script, what you can see here is the command line that I use for pdfChip. And you'll notice that there is indeed an additional command line parameter, --import or -- import. Then I have written card data, so that's the name part that I had in my presentation. And then I have the path to that file, and I'm specifying that in a relative way in this case. So I'm simply saying, look for the file in the current directory, in the same directory as the HTML file, look for a file called data.json. So if I go back to my folder, this is the folder where I have the index.html file. Well, in the same folder, I have a file called data.json. That's the one I want pdfChip to open, and I would expect pdfChip to put that in cchip.user.card data. That's because of this name part that I specify here. Now, if you look at the JavaScript that takes advantage of that, so this is the built-in cchip print loop function. And what I do here is I get that variable. So I'm simply saying the variable the card equals, and then this is the data that was read by pdfChip from the JSON file, and then I have a number of jQuery statements to find different paragraphs or different pieces of text in my business card and replace those, and I have the same thing for the barcode. So all I need to do in this case, I don't have to open an XML file and parse that and so on, which typically gives you 50 lines of code easily. I don't have to do that. The only thing I have to do is specify cchip.user.card data, and pdfChip will automatically load the JSON file, put it in the cchip object in that location that I requested, and I can simply use that information and be done with it. Very, very straightforward. Now, does it work? That's a good question. If I take my build script and I run that, and we look at the PDF file that was generated, then you can see that it generates a different business card now with new information and well, it's more difficult to see, but a new QR code as well. Okay, so very, very simple and straightforward. A minor change in pdfChip 1.1, but if you have information that you want to pass to a template, this is actually a nice way of doing it. And the JSON file, let me just stress that bit. The JSON file does not need to be in the same folder as your template. So it can be wherever you want it to be. It can live anywhere your PHP script will generate it. You simply pass the correct path on the command line, and that's it. I didn't show the actual HTML file in this case because it's relatively trivial. As you can see, it's the same as what I had before, just different pieces of text, and each of these paragraphs has an ID, and that's the ID I reference in that JavaScript that I have before. The only thing of note in here is that it does actually include the JSON file, of course, because I'm using that from my script. So you do have to include a JSON file in there to make that. Well, actually, I don't even have to do that. It will be done automatically. So no, I don't have to do that. That's old stuff that is still in there. Okay, so that will make your life easier. I can promise you that if you're passing on information to a template like that. So have a look at that. It's really, really simple. Just add the command line parameter and start using the information there. It is really very, very straightforward. Good. A smaller item, well, smaller and not smaller if you need it. It's very important. One of the requests that we've been getting quite frequently is, and this does not solve all of the requests, but it does solve some of them already. One of the requests we've gotten relatively frequently is, if you place a PDF file, can I in some way get information from that PDF file and use that in my templates? And I'll give you an example. What if I want to make a good for print page, like a proof page, And in that proof page, I want to show the actual object that I'm going to print, a label or a flyer or whatever it is. But if I want to make a letter-sized or A4-sized proof page, then I probably am going to have to rescale the PDF that I include. So I'm going to have to rescale that final art when I include it in the proofing page. And it would be really cool if I could show on the proof page how that was scaled, what the percentage is that final work is going to be scaled down. In pdfChip 1.0, there was no way to do that. And the reason you can't do it is, well, you can place a PDF object in an HTML template. That's one of the extensions that pdfChip adds. But there is no way to get information from that PDF that you place. And in pdfChip 1.1, there are two pieces of information that you can learn from a placed PDF. One is the number of pages it has, and second is the size of the page boxes in that file. And this is an example JavaScript function that I wrote, and the purpose of this example is to calculate what the scaling is of a PDF object that you've placed. So in this case, I allow you to specify an object that could be by ID, for example. In that case, it would be in object would be pound, the pound sign, and then the name, the ID that you assign to that placed PDF document. And what I'm using here is an additional function that you now have in the CChip object. So again, that's built-in CChip object. And that function is called getPDFPageBox. And getPDFPageBox requires an object. So it requires the actual HTML element that is that placed PDF file. And then it specifies that it specifies the page box that you want information about. So in my case, I'm saying trim because I want information about the trim size or the size of the trim box in that document. And what it will return is an object that contains the height and width of the trim box in points, so in PDF points. And in this case, I get the width of that object. On the other hand, I can use a function like the jQuery function width to get the size of that placed PDF in the DOM tree, so in the HTML tree. And then I have a factor in there because that returns pixels, and to go from pixels to points, I have to do times 0.75. And then the last line there calculates what the percentage is. So if I have to scale down my PDF to 50%, this function will answer 50 because that is the percentage that that PDF file is now shown at. So this will again be easier to understand if I show you an example. What I have here is very simple. I have two divs, and then in each div I have an image. Both of those images are actually PDF files, and if I go into my images folder, you can see what those are. This is actually a relatively small one. This is a much bigger one. So I have two PDF files that I am going to place. And under the image, there is a label, and that label has a placeholder text that will be replaced, hopefully with the correct percentage afterwards. So that's what I have in HTML. CSS is equally simple. You can just double-click that. And in the CSS, you can see that the div that I have in both cases is absolute, and it has a specific height and width. So I have a specific height in there each time of 10 centimeters. And the image is set to a maximum width and a maximum height of 10 centimeters. That means that the images are going to be scaled down to fit in the box that I have. And I can show you what that looks like by going to the HTML. The percentage is not going to be correct, of course, but the rest is correct. So what you get here is an HTML box, and that is in the one example is red as a background. The second one is green as a background. That's just so that you can see what is going on. And then I want to scale those files, those PDF files, inside of there. Let me run this so that we can see what the PDF file says. If you look at the generated PDF, I again have my red box and my green box in here, and you can see that the label for the top one has been replaced by 91. So what you're seeing here is actually 91% of the real size of the PDF file. So it has been scaled down a little bit. And for the bottom one, it says 35%. So this one has been scaled down a lot more in order to fit it within this green box. The boxes are the same size, but the PDF files are different sizes, so the percentage is different as well. And then just to show you again how that is done in scripting, what you have here is that that same function as I showed you before, and the way it is used is by saying, well, give me the scale for that image. So I specify # penguin1 image. That's the ID that image has in my HTML file, and that function in this case will return 91 because that's the scaling factor, and that 91 is then set in using jQuery again, is then set into the first label I have in the HTML file. And then the same for the second image, I get the scaling percentage and I set that in that label, and then I call print pages to generate everything. So the only reason this works is because of this function here, this get PDF page box, where I pass the image and where I ask for the trim box. And this could also be bleed, crop, art, or media. If there is no trim box, then it will default to the media box. So those rules that you typically have to follow in PDF have been fully implemented in the JavaScript that you have here. The only thing you have to do is say get PDF page box. Of course, remember that this only works in PDF 1.1. If you try this in pdfChip 1.0, then you'll get probably a JavaScript exception, because the CChip object will not know that function that is new in pdfChip 1.1. So again, very simple, and in a similar way, you can get the number of pages from a PDF file, but very simple, an additional function that you can call, and the result from that, you do whatever you want to do. You could show the exact dimensions of the page box or the trim box, for example. You could use that to position files. You could even use this to do a pretty nice piece of impositioning. You simply need a JavaScript file that looks at all the input files in that case, gets the trim size of each of those, and then calculates what it wants to do with those files to place them on a larger sheet. So how you use the information is secondary, but remember that in pdfChip 1.1, you have the ability to get that information for a PDF document that you place in your file, in your HTML template. That brings us to the last topic, and this is a relatively complex one, but also one that needed to be solved, that was asked quite a lot. And the topic title is automatically generating lists. Now, what are we talking about? Well, if you, specifically for longer documents, how are you able to generate lists of items automatically? And that could be something like a table of contents. It could also be a list of figures, like a table of figures that you have in a document. You could use this to track references and make a list of references at the end of a document. There is a whole range of things that people want to use this for, but it all boils down to the same thing. You have something that repeats throughout the document, and rather than making a static HTML file to list those items, you would want that list to be built automatically. A very good example, if you have looked at the pdfChip documentation, all of the pdfChip documentation is generated by pdfChip. So we've written that in HTML, and we then used pdfChip to convert it into a PDF document. Those documents contain a table of contents. I can tell you that that was not a lot of fun because the table of contents was generated by hand. It's a static HTML file in the documentation that you have because pdfChip 1.0 was not capable of building those things in an automatic fashion. In 1.1, we add that, and we add that using a concept called a list collector, and there is a 4-step procedure that you have to follow. This is complicated the first time. The second time you need this slide with the bullet points to do the right thing, and then after that it's actually pretty straightforward. So let me walk you through this. There are 4 steps. Tag an element, ask pdfChip to gather information for all of those elements that were tagged, use that information to modify the HTML and thus the generated PDF file, and then the 4th point mysteriously says rinse and repeat. That's not going to cut it. So I'm going to go in a little bit more detail for each of those 4, and then I'll show you an example with the table of content for the pdfChip documentation to show how it works in practice. But let's go over these 4 in a little bit more detail. The first one is, if you want to collect information, if you want to make a list of something, you need to tell pdfChip what elements you want to gather information about. And the way you do that in pdfChip 1.1 is by, first of all, tagging elements with a CSS rule. And you can see that there are 2 examples. The first CSS rule applies to all elements of the header level 1, all H1 elements. And what it does is it tells it which font to use, which font size to use, and then it has a custom pdfChip rule that says cchip list collector, and then it adds talk to that table of content. You can add the cchip list collector rule to any CSS rule that you specify in your project. You can have as many as you want, and the name that you put next to it, talk in this example, can be the same in different places of your CSS, or it can be different. The only thing that this does is it tells pdfChip that you are interested in elements, in this case H1 elements, and that you want to gather information about those H1 elements in a table or a list called talk. What you can see is that in my HTML or CSS rather snippet that I have here, I do the same for images. So I am saying that for images, I also want to save information, but in this case, I want to specify that the name of the list will be images. And I saw that someone said, oops, that is my Apple mouse that is not behaving. I saw that someone said, well, you have different signs around talk and images. Both of those actually will work in CSS. It doesn't matter, but it should just be the same, of course. But the bottom line is you can gather information about as many elements as you want. The way to gather or the way to specify which elements interest you is by using CSS. And it's by inserting that custom cchip list collector tag or rule in some of your CSS that you have in that project. That's the first step. And what you see here are 2 classic examples. H1 could be used to build a table of content. Maybe I also want to have H2 elements marked, and then I could use the same talk rule also for the H2 header elements. That's all of that is possible. But H1 for a talk is obvious. image could be used to build a table of images at the end, but you can do whatever you want. It's very flexible. Simply insert those rules into your CSS files for the elements that you are interested in. That's one. Secondly, you need to tell pdfChip that you are doing this and that you want it to remember information for those elements that you tagged in the CSS file. The way to do that is, again, with a specific command line parameter. In this case, it's called --list collector. And after the equal sign, you have a path to a file. That does not need to exist, but it instructs pdfChip to gather information about all of these elements that you tagged and to write that information into the file data list collector.js in this example. What you have here can be an absolute path, but it can also be, and typically it will be, relative to your HTML file. So in this case, I'm saying in the same directory as my index.html, look at a folder called data, and in that folder, you have to create a file called listcollector.js. If that file already exists, it will be overwritten by, right? So pdfChip will scan the CSS, it will remember which elements it needs to track, and then information for those elements will be written to listcollector.js for you automatically. The only thing you have to do is add that additional command line parameter. The third step is to use that information, of course. Now, the way to do that is the same mechanism as what you've already seen in a way by in that business card example. Here, I have to include the generated JSON file, so I have to put that in my HTML file, reference it, and then I can use the data from it to modify my HTML, and we will end up with the same jQuery statements or just JavaScript statements to do something with the information. And I'll show you an example of that later on. And then it says, and this is a little bit tricky, it says rinse and repeat. Why? Well, there are a couple of weird things or a couple of complex things with this system. First of all, the first time that you run pdfChip, that JSON file is not going to exist. It's only built during the first run. So the first time your JavaScript will attempt to do something, that JSON file will not exist. And your JavaScript must be capable of handling that situation. It cannot rely on the fact that that JSON file and the information in it will always be available. It has to fail gracefully if that information is not available and simply do nothing. But more importantly, take the example of where you are generating a table of content. A table of content is typically at the beginning of the file. Now, if I add a table of content and I have a lot of information in that table of content, the table of content by itself might have a number of pages. And so the page numbers for the rest of the document might very well change by me generating the table of contents. So what you have here is something where it could take 2 or 3 pdfChip runs in order to get to a situation that is stable. And I'll come back to that after I've shown you how this looks in practice, because it's not an easy point. It can be a little bit of a challenge, and I want to make sure that you understand what the issue is. So let me go to an example. And first of all, let me show you that I don't have, I'm going to go into this folder here. I don't have a PDF file. I have my index files. In this case, I have a lot of index files, actually. I have a bunch of resources that I use, and I have a build script. And if I look at that build script, it's a relatively long one, so I have an overlay and an underlay. That's to add page numbers and background graphics and so on. Then I have my list collector line that says generate a file in the map in the folder called resources, scripts, and then collector data.js. So resources, scripts. It should be generated here, and you can see that there is no file called collectordata.js in here. It doesn't exist right now. And then I have all of my HTML files, and I specify that I want to generate something called pdfChip introduction.pdf. So that's my command line that I am going to run. Now, I'm going to run it once, and then I'm going to show you what happens in here and why. Take the command line script here, run that, and that will go through a whole bunch of steps. Now, if you watch this folder attentively, you will see two changes. First of all, I have a PDF file that was generated. And secondly, I now have a file called collectordata.js. How do we get that file? Remember the 4 steps that I mentioned. The first step was tag the elements that you are interested in. So if I go to styles and I go to pdfChip documentation and we look at level 1, H1, in here I have cchip list collector talk. And it's the only occurrence of that list collector that I have in my file. So only for anything that is tagged as an H1 element, I'm saying list this in talk. That was the first step. The second step I said was use that command line parameter, which we did, and then pdfChip will generate that file for you automatically, which it did. Collectordata.js. It wasn't there, now it is there. If I open that file, you'll see that this is a JSON file. It will always have a variable called cchip list collector. That's always here. And cchip list collector will have lists of information. For each name that I specify in one of those CSS tags, it will create one list. I only have one, and that was named talk. So it automatically created a list called talk. It's a list or an array if you want. That you can see that with the square bracket here. That runs all the way to the bottom where it's closed. And for each thing that I tagged, so for each H1 element, pdfChip remembered this information for me. The content, that's the content of that H1 tag. In my case, that's the content of the actual title that I have there. The ID of that element, the page that element occurred on, and then the tag used for that particular element. Why the tag and the ID? Well, if in my CSS file I use a class, for example, then everything that has that particular class will have an item in this list. And in that case, it might be helpful to know what the ID of those elements is, what the actual element was, whether it's a paragraph or an image or a div, or depending on your HTML file, this can be very useful information. But the most important information for what I want to do here is the content and the actual page number. Okay, so that was step 2, if I'm correct. Yeah, so mark in the CSS, use the command line parameter, and pdfChip generates collectordata.js for me. And then the third step is use that information that is in here to build a table of content file. And in order to do that, I have this little script here, and that has a function called make talk. So let me open up the HTML file as well. My HTML file for the table of contents, well, that doesn't have anything in here. It simply says div ID is talk, and then a comment that says filled automatically, but there are no items in here. It is only when the make talk function runs that it will use the information from the list collector data to generate a table of content. Now remember what I said with this rinse and repeat stuff. The first time you do this, there is no JSON file. You've never run this, so there is no JSON file yet. That's why I have this testing here at the top. If that JSON file doesn't exist, then this cchip list collector item will not exist either. And if that cchip list collector item does not exist, then I don't have to I don't have to do anything. I know that the file wasn't there. I don't have any information, so I can't build a table of content. And actually, the first time you run this, that's exactly what's going to happen. If you look at this document, I have a nice first page, but the table of contents page is empty. This was the first run for this particular template. I didn't have my JSON file, so I don't have information on table of content items, so it is empty. If it isn't empty, if it exists, then my JavaScript will look for the div marked with that particular ID. So for the div where I want to have the table of content, and then you can basically do what you want. In my case, I add some text, a number basically, and then the actual content text of the element, and then a hyphen, page, and a page number. Right, so, but that's up to you. That's a little JavaScript function to use the information I have in that JSON file. Now, you can't really see what the result is of that, but if we run the same script again, exact same build script, I didn't change anything. It's the exact same command that I'm issuing here. If you do that again and I reopen my PDF file now, well, now you can see that I have a table of content. And the table of content in my example shows a number. It shows the content of the header. So if I go to the first section, it says pdfChip in a nutshell. That's also what you have here. And it shows me that I have page 3 for that, and that is actually page 3. Now, I don't generate links automatically in this example, but that could also be done. It is possible to also automatically create links as you are building the table of content. Okay, so if I quit that again, and I run this again, I would get the exact same result. Why? Well, if I run it again, my JSON data actually has not changed. It was overwritten by pdfChip, but it hasn't changed. The page numbers in it haven't changed. If I had more items in my table of content, and I'm almost there actually, but if I had a few more items in my table of content, the table of content might have to be split over 2 pages. And in that case, the page numbers that I get in the first run would not be valid anymore. They would still change. So I would need 3 runs of pdfChip to do the right thing. Every time you run pdfChip, this data is overwritten. And I can show that to you quite easily. If I reopen, do I still have my CSS file somewhere here? No, if I reopen my CSS, and I don't know, what do we want to gather information for? Well, maybe information about all of the code examples that we have in here. Let's be a good developer and not write too much to copy paste. So I wanted to gather, maybe make a list of code references. So I can say list this as code, just save that style, run this again, and hopefully when I open this again, look, now I have a list called code, and that has the actual code examples in here. And I have, if I scroll down, there's lots of code examples. If I scroll down, I still have my list called table of content. So every time you run pdfChip on a particular template, it will automatically recreate collectordata.js, overwriting what was there. And then in your script, you can take advantage of that information. Now, how do I know when to stop? How do I know that this invocation of pdfChip is actually the correct one? That's a bit of a difficult question. There are different answers to that. The first answer is if you have a particular template, like what I'm working on here, I can very easily figure out that running pdfChip 3 times will always do the right thing. It will always give me something that is stable. That's because I only have a table of content. What I'm doing is adding content to that. That might change once, but it's not going to change more than once. So I need to run it once to generate the JSON file. The second time I will generate my table of content, and if the table of content is more than one page, then I will need a third run. But for this type of template, it will always be 3 runs. If you do more complex things, we've experimented, for example, with building a template where every chapter would begin on an even page or on an odd page, depending on what you're trying to do. That means that you have to insert empty pages. And that means that you're building a template where it might very well be possible or necessary to run it more than 3 times. What you could do in that case is in your script that you use to run pdfChip, build a loop, observe the collector data.js file, for example, and only if the content of that file no longer changes, then say this is okay. We're looking at ways of building that type of checking into pdfChip itself, but in pdfChip 1.1 at the moment, you are responsible to make sure that you run the application as many times as it needs to be run. Okay, let me see if there are any questions and get those answered. Actually, this was one very early in the file. I think those were actually answered. Can you replace text? Yes, absolutely. So in the JavaScript file, you can absolutely replace text that you have in HTML. You can do that with just JavaScript, or the easiest way is to include jQuery and do it with jQuery. It's the same as doing it in plain JavaScript, but jQuery offers a lot of pre-built functionality, and it's usually faster to use that than try to reinvent the thing from scratch every time. Okay, I think those are the questions that I saw. If you still have a question, feel free to send it in or still ask. Let me very quickly go over what we covered today, and then we'll call it a day. So smaller improvements, the main smaller improvement had to do with the limit that you can put to the number of pages in the file and using device n in an HTML template. So you can build or support things like duotones, for example, or those kinds of scenarios. Then we looked at a way to pass information across a command line call, and that is by specifying in an additional command line parameter, specifying the path to a JSON file that is then automatically loaded into the CChip object, so you can very easily access the information from your JavaScript. And then we looked at a way to automatically build lists in your PDF file. And the obvious example, of course, is a table of content where you want to gather information about all headings in the file, and you want to automatically build a table with those headings, potentially with the page number where they occur, potentially with a link to that place in the PDF document as well. Okay, that is it from my side. pdfChip 1.1 is out, so you can just go to the Calas or 4P's website and download it there. If you need if you want to try it, you simply have to activate the trial. There is information on how to activate a trial version in the actual download. So download pdfChip, there is a text file in there and documentation in there that explains how to go through trial activation. If you run into any questions, don't hesitate to come back to us and ask. And like I said, if there is anything that you want to accomplish with pdfChip and you don't manage to do so, we can either see if we can help you with that, or we alternatively also offer professional services that would implement that functionality for you. Good. Thanks for joining this webinar. I think well, I'm not sure. There is actually another webinar, the same webinar coming up next week in German. Might have been better if I said that at the beginning of the webinar rather than at the end, but it is coming up in German as well next week. So you can still go back and listen to, I think that will be Mark who will be doing that on the CAS side. Same information, but in German. Thanks for joining. I only have to wish you a very nice rest of the day, and I'm sure I will be seeing many of you for a future webinar again. Have a great day.